All right, I think we'll get started. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today to our first SAD 2021 talk in the Spatial Analytics and Data Seminar Series, hosted by Newcastle University, University of Bristol, and the Alan Turing Institute. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Professor Geoff Boeing from the University of Southern California. He studies sort of urban structure and is here today to give an excellent talk on street network models and indicators for every urban area in the world. So I have no doubt that those of you that have attended the past talks in this series will find this absolutely riveting. I would like to remind you though, if you can keep your head about you while you're getting your socks blown off, to submit questions through the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That'll help us make sure that there's a robust discussion at the end of Dr. Boeing's talk. So with that, I'll stop screen sharing and let Dr. Boeing get on with the presentation.
Hey everybody, thanks Levi and Rachel for having me today. Levi, thanks for no pressure there. Let me share my screen. Can you all see that okay? It's like some yeses. All right, yes, so I'm happy to be here as part of the SAD seminar series in a new year. Fortunately, it turns out 2021 is pretty sad so far, but hopefully it'll turn it around by the summer. So I'm Geoff Boeing. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. And I'm going to talk with you a little bit today about modeling and analyzing street networks. And in particular, the focus of today's talk is going to be thinking about how to do this in a relatively consistent way around the world. So explicitly thinking about how we can do some comparative analysis in different parts of the world. It's not going to be perfect. There are some data limitations, even though things are a lot better today than they were just 5, let alone 10 years ago. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those caveats, some of the models, different indicators, and some empirical findings. So I'm going to start off with first thinking about why we would want to analyze street networks. So what is the role of street networks in urban studies more broadly, transportation planning, and urban design more specifically? Then I'll talk through some tools that we can use to try to look at different parts of the world in terms of their street network form, to understand accessibility, resilience, connectivity, how the infrastructure segregates or connects us. Then I'll go through a couple of projects. One recent project that I recently published looking at street network models and indicators in the US, some of the things we were able to tease out of that analysis. And then moving on to the current project, looking at these models and indicators of street network form worldwide. And I'll conclude with a few analytical findings. So some preliminary work kind of poking into what these models might tell us about different cities, how they're alike or different, and some pointers forward for research. So areas in which we might need some better methods to get better analytics in the future. But first off, to set this whole project up, I want to think for just a few minutes about why we study street networks in the context of travel and equity. So street networks and other urban transportation networks provide a sort of substrate or connective tissue that help to organize all of a city's human dynamics. So here we can see 4 different networks that are all held at the same scale of 1 square mile. Now, holding them at that same scale, let's just quickly compare the different pattern and texture and grain of these street networks, how they reflect different transportation technologies and design paradigms, different politics and expressions of power, culture, economic conditions, underlying terrain in each of these cities. For example, you can consider the different histories and values that are embedded in the classic street grid, from Hippodamus's early urban design work in ancient Greece, to the Law of the Indies, to the US Homestead Act, to the New York Commissioner's Plan. The grid has been used for millennia to try to express a certain human order over the landscape, or to organize transportation around spaces of power and control, or to make land more amenable to real estate speculation, being able to buy plots of land sight unseen. Or alternatively, consider Haussmann's 19th century renovation of Paris and the different values that were embedded in that plan. Or the autocentric form of different US Sunbelt cities and the notions of lifestyle and aspiration and privilege and exclusion that are very explicitly built into certain types of cities and suburbs around the world, very often through their transportation networks that shape those human flows. In particular, all of these street networks demonstrate varying levels of connectedness or accessibility, compactness, resilience, and sustainability. If we start to add in building footprints or parcels or demographic information, we can start thinking about how households have access to jobs or schools or stores, how different racial or ethnic groups have differential access. It's often explicitly planned into circulation infrastructure, and housing markets are very often segregated to give different kinds of people access for political reasons. Now this, in this figure, this one always is interesting to me because on the top row, we can see sort of a 19th century American paradigm of griddedness in New York and San Francisco with its perimeter blocks. A very different urbanization model than we see in the informal settlements in the global South, here illustrated by Monrovia and Port-au-Prince, where the building footprints almost disappear into sort of fractal dust, very fine scales, with mostly informal circulation networks taking over within individual neighborhoods. Now, transportation planning has restructured urban networks over time, over and over and over again. And when it does that, it redistributes both access and equity through travel ease and travel costs differently for different groups of people. Now, transportation planning has studied street networks for years, but today we can evaluate the outcomes of transportation planners' actions in new ways through the tools of network science and computational data science. So here you can see a typical set of US cities in different eras. In the 1900s, we have these sort of imperfect grids. By the 1940s, you start seeing the redesign around circuitous, car-centric suburbs. And then by the 1990s, you see the totally disconnected, car-dependent sprawl that lays on the periphery of so many US cities and similar patterns in many other places that have urbanized since the 1980s as well. So to try to understand some of these different patterns, equity questions around cities, sustainability questions around cities, we need different tools to be able to do it. Today, I'm going to present a tool called OSMnx that I developed, which is kind of the methods package underlying all of the different empirical stuff that I'll be walking through in just a few minutes. But first, it might be useful to introduce what this tool is and does to be able to show you what I'm doing with it later. So OSMnx is a little bit of a mouthful of an acronym. Stands for OpenStreetMap plus NetworkX. If you're not familiar with it, OpenStreetMap is kind of like Wikipedia meets Google Maps. So it's a worldwide collaborative mapping project anyone can contribute to. NetworkX is a network analysis package that was developed at Los Alamos National Lab. So OSMnx is kind of like glue to hook them together, as well as hooking together a few other packages like GeoPandas. So OSMnx lets you download, model, and analyze street networks, as well as a few other things. So I have 4 key features listed here. You can download and model stuff from OSM. You can also algorithmically correct and process your network's topology. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, but the short story is on OpenStreetMap, there's a lot more data to represent the street network than what we really want in a typical primal graph of streets. I'll show you that unpacked with a graphic in a few minutes. OSMnx also lets you download building footprints, points of interest, elevation data, transit stops, parks, grocery stores, anything else that you have on OpenStreetMap, with the elevation data coming by default from the Google Maps API. And then you can do analysis, so route calculation, you can project and visualize your graphs, you can calculate different indicators for the geometry, topology of the network, etc. Now, it's worth unpacking what OpenStreetMap itself looks like. If you're not familiar with it, this is a screenshot of OSM in downtown Los Angeles. So OSM, as I mentioned briefly a second ago, it's a public mapping platform, geospatial database. It has worldwide coverage and anyone can contribute to it. In a lot of ways, OpenStreetMap is better than what came before. So traditionally, we would acquire street network data from something like the Tiger Line roads shapefiles in the US, the Census Bureau develops. I believe in the UK, you have a similar roads shapefile from the Ordnance Survey. Those work relatively well, especially for geometric studies of streets. But shapefiles aren't necessarily networks. They provide you with a lot of geometry information, but not much topology information. So that distinction refers to the difference between like positions in space, lengths and areas, widths, angles for geometry, whereas topology refers to connections and configurations. Shapefiles are good at the former, but they don't carry much topology information. Second problem is that shapefiles aren't very good for doing bulk or automated analyses. You have to download one shapefile at a time for each study site, load it up, process it, intersect out the exact pieces of that shapefile that you want to work with, and then do some calculations on it. At least in the US context, those Tiger Line road shapefiles also didn't do a very good job of covering informal paths or pedestrian circulation routes or corridors between buildings or walkways through parks. It was very much car-oriented roadway focused. And perhaps most importantly, each country or sometimes even city or state's roads data are limited to that place. So that means that in the US, we can access US specific roads data. In the UK, we can get UK roads data, but it gets harder and harder as you go out to more cities and more countries. Language barriers exist. Shapefiles are digitized according to different standards by different agencies. There's often access difficulties or signups in different places. It can be very hard to do cross-sectional research in an international context. Now, OpenStreetMap helps to resolve a lot of those challenges. It includes spatial boundaries, streets, pedestrian paths, bike lanes, building footprints, amenities, all kinds of stuff, as you can see here in this figure. It tends to be pretty high quality when compared to other reference data sets like the Tiger Line road shapefile, but the data can be a little bit hard to extract from OSM. You have to work with its individual APIs. They have their own query languages, which can be a little bit cumbersome to script against. Or you can go to a third-party service and download a third-party extract of raw data. But then you come up with all the same problems as before, having to process it all, turn it into some kind of graph theoretic model. So OSMnx aims to fill that gap where it's an open source Python package that lets you download data from anywhere in the world and then model it. So for example, with just one simple query, I can request a graph from place, Los Angeles, California, specify a network type. So here this is a drivable street network. And just like that, it gives me the drivable street network for the city of Los Angeles. Now we're not constrained to city borders here. You could pass in a polygon of any study site and get all of the infrastructure within that polygon. You could just as easily query for neighborhoods, boroughs, counties, states, nations, any boundary polygon that OSM has in its places database. And because it's worldwide, you can also query in the same way anywhere in the world. So we can get the street network for Modena, Italy, or the Medina of Tunis, which is an example I always like because you can really clearly see here different city planning regimes of the more organic, self-organized urban fabric in the old medieval Medina that evolved over centuries versus the French colonial planning, the grid down closer to the waterfront. And we can also get elevation data. So by default, OSMnx will ask you for your Google API key, and it'll automatically attach Google elevations to each node in your network, and then calculate all of the edge grades. So the edges would be the street segments linking the nodes, which are intersections and dead ends. By edge grade, I mean rise over run. So it gives you the incline of the streets in your network. Now the elevation data can be really useful for certain kinds of analyses. So for example, not only can we model the street grades to understand where roads are steeper or shallower, but it also lets us start to understand different phenomena like sea level rise or flooding events. Which parts of the network are most prone to having infrastructure disruptions during different kinds of flooding events? What kinds of people live there? And whose trips are most prone to being disrupted by climate or fire or earthquake? We can also use elevation data to create better impedance functions. So when we're doing routing and transportation planning, we use impedance functions to understand how long it'll take you to get from point A to point B, given different utilities for the individual users of the road network. Now, typically when we're doing something like car trips, we'll use an impedance function that minimizes something like travel time so that you take the quickest path between an origin and a destination. Now, if you are a cyclist, you might want a different impedance function. So for example, if you can shave 5 seconds off your bike ride, but it means you have to go straight up a really steep hill and straight down the other side, some masochists might prefer that. But a lot of people would rather bike just around the hill, add 5 seconds to their bike ride, stay on relatively flat ground, and not be a sweaty wreck when you get to the office in the morning. If we include elevation information in that impedance function, we can use that to help model trips for different modes of active travel. So that's a quick tour of what the package does. Now I'm going to talk about different models and indicators in a couple of different projects. So the first project was US specific. The second project is worldwide. For that first project, so I recently modeled the street networks of the entire US at different scales. So that's every city or town, urban area, county, census tract, and Zillow defined neighborhood. So it's what like realtors think of as neighborhoods, for whatever that's worth. We then calculate several indicators of each to try to understand the street network form in different places. And then I put all of those models and indicators in an open data repository. So it's every city, town, urban area, county, tract, and Zillow defined neighborhood. Now, among those indicators, one thing I was interested in was the idea of griddedness. So in some parts of the world, but very famously in the US, a lot of our core cities are built around a street grid. So this is something that came out throughout American history from the 1700s on, sort of gridded paradigm based on Enlightenment principles of rationally laying out streets and land in the American frontier. To try to understand griddedness, I wanted to look at a few different components, including the proportion of four-way intersections. So one benefit of grids is that they tend to be fairly well connected. They give you high connectivity. You have 4 different streets at every intersection point in the grid. Also straightness. So it tends to be pretty straight from point A to point B, as long as you're going in one of the cardinal directions along which the grid is aligned. And then lastly, the idea of orientation entropy. What I mean by that is that in a grid, there tends to be pretty low orientation entropy. So the street network's orientation tends to have low entropy. It tends to point in very few directions. And we can see that with these polar histograms. So in Manhattan, what we're seeing here are that the different bins represent bins around the compass, so the bearings of streets. And each bar's length represents the relative frequency of streets that fall into that bin. So in Manhattan, the vast majority of streets fall into one of 4 bins that align with the grid. It's about 29 degrees off of true north. You can see that in its streets. We see a different spatial orientation in Boston, where the streets tend to be aligned in all different directions. There are some grids like in South Boston or the Back Bay, but they tend to mismatch with each other, and many other parts of the cities don't have a grid at all, just because of the era in which they developed, the fact that some of them developed under 19th century pastoralism, others developed just as little village footpaths and cowpaths that slowly urbanized over centuries. But we have very different spatial patterns here. And one way to capture that is through that idea of orientation entropy, as visualized in these 2 histograms. So combining this idea of orientation entropy with the proportion of 4-way intersections and the straightness of the streets, we can produce a grid index that captures different theoretical aspects of griddedness. So here we can see where places are more or less grid-like today. Now, if you are familiar with US history, you'll notice something here, that today the most grid-like places tend to be across the Midwest and the Great Plains. Some of that is geography. These are some of the flattest areas of all of the United States. It's very easy to lay out grids where there's flat land. It's much harder to do that in mountains, unless you're the city of San Francisco, where you just lay out a grid irrespective of the underlying terrain. But aside from just being fairly flat land, these parts of the country were also once considered the East Coast's frontier. And from the Homestead Act, they rapidly laid out these grids across the entire country, built railroad lines along them, had instant towns appear along that, and made for very easy parcelization of US real estate for speculators. We still see the vestiges of those old planning instruments and land use instruments there today, but not everywhere. So in some places, there was much more rapid urbanization in the late 20th century. California's suburbs are one example of that, where its core cities tend to be pretty grid-like because of when they were built in the 19th century, but its suburbs are less so, reflecting later eras of urbanization. We can start to see those waves of urbanization here if we look at these patterns over time. So this is a snapshot of characteristics today of urban street networks that were built in different eras, from pre-1940 all the way up through the previous decade. Now here I'm estimating tract vintage in a couple of different ways. I'm looking at it both through when structures were built in each of these places. This is looking at every census tract in the country. So I'm looking at both when structures were built, and I'm also looking at real estate transaction data to try to understand when the earliest places were being developed there, under the theory that street networks usually appeared roughly around the same time as the first structures. Now, we see a very similar pattern here over time. From around the time of World War II through the 1990s, there's a clear downward trend across all this basket of variables toward more sprawl, less griddedness, less straightness, less connectivity. You get coarser block lengths and less intersection density. And we also see a rise in the number of vehicles per household today in tracts of different eras. But since 1990, we see a rebound in that trend toward more traditional street network patterns. So we see more griddedness in the orientation order, to the inverse of entropy. We see more straightness in the streets that are being built today, more connectivity with four-way intersections and fewer dead ends. And we also see that street networks built in the past 2 decades tend to have lower number of vehicles per household in those places as well. Now, this would be very easily confounded by all kinds of things. So for example, it could be that older tracts have fewer vehicles per household and more grid-like streets because those are poorer neighborhoods today, given white flight from old neighborhoods during the latter half of the 20th century. To try to understand that, we can control for other covariates in a spatial regression model to try to unpack transportation planning's manifestation in these different decades. So in particular, even when we control for covariates, we still see a similar story. Sprawl post-war before somewhat of a reversal over the last 2 decades. If you're interested in that previous piece of work in the US context, you can scan the QR code here, which will take you to it. And there's also a URL there if you want to see more about that. But what I really want to talk about today is where that basic research framework went next. So from the US context, I was increasingly interested in trying to generalize it to the rest of the world. A lot of studies look at street networks within a single country, but very few of them are able to look worldwide just because of different data quality, digitization, access issues that I mentioned earlier. So for the current piece of work that I'm working on, I wanted to model the street networks for every urban area in the world, create indicators and analyze them. So to do this, I used urban area boundaries that were derived from the global human settlement layer. Now, there are a few past challenges that made this kind of work difficult. So first, defining consistent study site boundaries was usually pretty hard. It was hard to say what is or isn't a comparable study site in different parts of the world. Using municipalities doesn't work very well because municipalities mean something very different in, say, the US versus Australia versus China. Some places they mean more like the urbanized area. Some places they mean more like a small core city. The global human settlements layer helps us get around that challenge fairly well. Second challenge, consistent data around the world. So this is the one that I mentioned earlier when introducing OpenStreetMap. So OpenStreetMap helps us with that. It's not perfect, but it's better than what we've had before. In particular, driving infrastructure is pretty good around the world, especially in urban areas. With some lumpiness, China is one exception where the street network tends to be relatively poorly digitized there, mostly because of government regulations around data access and the legality of digitizing infrastructure in China. But it's still pretty good with something like 70, 80% of infrastructure maps at this point. And then lastly, modeling and analyzing large graphs is tough. So for some of the biggest urban areas, we need a lot of RAM and a lot of CPU power to be able to churn through it for analytics. To work around that challenge, for this project, I'm using a computing system with 128 gigs of RAM and 24 CPUs to do it in parallel. So with more computing power comes more powerful analytics, I guess, as we all know. So what I did for this project, as a quick overview, I got the network data from OSM, modeled it with OSMnx, like we talked about earlier. I calculated node elevations and edge grades for every urban area. And then I calculated street network indicators for each of those urban areas and did some summary analyses. And then all of that stuff, the code, the models, the indicators were all put online in open repositories for the public to reuse. So the modeling aspect of it, I mentioned I got the boundaries from the global human settlements layer. So if you're not familiar with it, it's worth briefly unpacking what that is. So the global human settlements layer is a project that uses spatial data mining to organize these vast swaths of data from satellite image streams, from censuses, from volunteer geographic information, lots of different stuff triangulated together to try to create boundaries. Now it has an urban centers database. It's one of its many products. And that urban centers database delineates urban area boundaries using all of those data and models from the wider GHSL project and some other open scientific data sources to add attribute data in as well. So you get population information, land cover information, climate information, GDP information, lots of other stuff. It defines all of those urban areas using population information and built up surface area across a 1 square kilometer grid around the world. And then it gives us urban areas separated from rural areas using a statistical method that is designed for international statistical comparison, so that we're able to compare these different urban areas to one another in a meaningful way. So OSMnx takes the polygons of those boundaries and downloads the street network within each. Then it topologically simplifies that OSM raw data. And this is something that I mentioned briefly at the beginning of the talk. It's illustrated here. So this is the original OSM data. Originally, what OpenStreetMap gives you are nodes as points. So if a street curves, the ways or edges are all straight line segments linked to one another by nodes. That's not how we normally think of street networks in graph theory. Rather, we would think of it as something like this, where the nodes are intersections or dead ends, and the street segments are possibly curving spatial geometries that link those nodes together. So OSMnx has an algorithm that will take that raw data and then convert it into a topologically simplified graph like this, so that nodes are intersections and dead ends, and edges are street segments. Next, once it has these models, it adds elevation data to each of the nodes and then calculates edge grade. And then we deposit all the models in an open repository. Now the elevation data here, I mentioned earlier that OSMnx has built in the ability to get elevation data from Google Maps, the elevation API. And that works fine when you're doing your own models and analyses, but because it's a closed commercial data source, although it's really high quality, I can't put those data into my models and put them in a public data repository because that would violate their terms of use. So for this project, I'm only using the Google elevation data as a validation reference point. All of the elevations for this graph come from either the ASTER or SRTM digital elevation models. So what I do is I retrieve the ASTER or SRTM elevation values for each node in every urban area in the world. And then I select between those two sources, whichever has the least absolute difference from the Google elevation API as a validation reference point. I'll look more at how that validation turned out in the end, but for now, the takeaway would be that because these two are public open data, they make for easy reuse in publicly available models later. They are not as high of quality overall as the Google elevation data are, but using this triangulation method lets us pick the better of the two for each point. Now, once you finished all that modeling and got all of the elevation data attached, I save each of those networks to disk as GraphML, GeoPackage, and node edge lists that people can reuse in the data repository. So GraphML files are an open source graph serialization format. GeoPackage, you probably all know, and node edge lists are just CSV formatted lists of nodes and edges. So once everything is modeled, we can calculate indicators. So that's indicators for each urban area, all put online in a different data repository. And these include things that are common in transport, urban design, network science. So indicators like intersection density, which tells us something about how dense the points of connection in the network are. Block lengths, which tell us about how long they are. So it's the kind of a linear proxy for block sizes. How long do you have to walk before you get to a next decision point where you can turn? So how permeable is that network? Circuity or straightness. How efficient is the network when you're doing routing? Orientation entropy, we talked about earlier, both a signature of griddedness, also a signature of top-down central planning. Clustering, which is useful for understanding the connectivity structure in the network, and lots of other stuff too. So the first thing that I did in this analysis was I wanted to validate the elevation data. So this is across all 37 million simplified nodes worldwide. And the elevation values exhibit really high correlation. So Aster versus SRTM, Aster versus Google, and SRTM versus Google all have correlation coefficients that exceed 0.999 and are all statistically significant. Now the Aster and SRTM values on average differ from each other. This is node-wise by only 19 centimeters. The median node between the two has the same value. So their pairwise difference here is 0. Now, you'll notice there are high min and max values for a lot of these. So the greatest difference between these two is the greatest absolute difference would be 441 meters. These are just outliers. There are a few of them, and the way in which we select the final node elevation value from either Aster or SRTM by using Google as a reference point helps to attenuate any outliers in the data set. Most importantly, across all of these urban areas, the median node's selected elevation value differs from the Google value by only about 30 centimeters. So they're very close to each other in the end using the open data versus a closed commercial data source. One other way to look at this would be average elevation values across the urban areas. So if we look at our street networks, average elevation values versus the global human settlements layers estimated averages, they're very strongly correlated. Once again, the correlation coefficient is greater than 0.999 across all urban areas. And the difference between the two, median, is only 19 centimeters. So in the end, the open data give us pretty reliable elevation information. Now, the next thing that I did in this analysis was look at intersection density, which is kind of like the canonical one measure of street networks. It's the most common one in transportation and urban design because it gives us a lot of information about the grain of the network, and because we're looking at intersections, something about the connectivity. But we don't always count intersections or calculate their density in the best possible way. So traditionally, when we are counting intersections in a street network, we look at all the nodes and we count the nodes that don't represent dead ends. That way, if they're either intersections or dead ends, we ignore the dead end nodes and take all the other nodes and count them as intersections. That works okay. But for example, many times you'll have complex street intersections, such as here. This is near where I live in LA. This is a divided road, and that divided road makes multiple intersection points at every true intersection. It has these funny like turn lanes, as well as 2 nodes every time that a cross street hits one of these divided edge center lines. To try to attenuate that problem, you could use some kind of geometric consolidation. That is, you buffer your nodes and merge any overlapping nodes that are within, say, 10 meters of each other. And I'll give you like a rough way of saying if the nodes are within some distance of each other, they really just represent one conceptual intersection, because intersections really have kind of fuzzy boundaries in the real world. They're not well defined. That works okay, but not always very well. So for example, here, I might not want to merge these two. I can't get across the street because there's a median running through it. It's not just a cluster of through roads, but rather these 2 points aren't connected to each other within 10 meters. So while they are spatially proximate to one another, they are not topologically proximate to one another. So for this project, I developed a new topological consolidation algorithm that, rather than geometrically buffering, finds nodes that are within n meters along the network topology itself and merges them together into one consolidated new intersection point. And you can kind of see that here. So while these 3 points all intersect each other buffer-wise, they don't all get merged together because these 2 are topologically distant from each other. Only the point that was here and the point that was here got merged together into one new node. So that gives us better intersection counts that more accurately represent how real-world intersections work. It's not perfect. There are arbitrary decisions about what those buffering distances should be and how they should work. But topological consolidation gives us something that more accurately reflects how urban designers and transport planners think about intersection counts and densities than either geometric consolidation do or just counting up non-dead end nodes. So when I looked at those different intersection counting methods, what I found was the traditional counting nodes method overcounted by 16% on average when compared to this topological consolidation method. The worst parts of the world for that were Australia, New Zealand, and Southern Europe. In both of those regions, we saw greater than 29% overcount by counting non-dead end nodes. And the worst countries were Australia, Spain, and Israel. In each of those countries, it was over 33%. Now, there's a reason why these certain places or countries tend to be overcounted. In particular, there's a bias here. A 1% increase in the urban area's GDP per capita is associated with a 0.25% increase in that overcount. That is, wealthier places tend to have worse overcounts if we're just using all those little points in space, rather than topologically thinking of intersections as one consolidated thing. Now, my hypothesis for why that would be is that in richer places, you tend to have more digitization and finer grained details are added. You're more likely to see things like slip lanes, turning lanes, individual sidewalks being digitized in wealthier countries than you are in poorer places where you're often limited to coarser grained road centerline geometries. Now, looking at a few different kind of key fundamental indicators here, we can look at some kind of seminal relationships at a new scale than we were able to look at before in the urban studies literature. So, for example, we can see that a unit increase in an urban area's intersection count is associated with about a 179 meter increase in its total street length. So these are pretty tightly linearly related to each other, as we would expect from theory. We also find that infrastructure scales sublinearly with population in these two figures. That is, residents can share infrastructure, so it tends to increase at a slower rate than populations do. So a 1% increase in population is associated with a 0.9% increase in total street length and a 0.95% increase in intersection count in an urban area. And across all urban areas, the mean per capita street length is about 2 meters. Every 10,000 US dollar increase in per capita GDP is associated with about 1 more meter of per capita street length in that urban area. And lastly, I looked at transportation emissions. So here I'm interested in the relationship between different street network forms and greenhouse gas emissions in different urban areas around the world. So here I estimated a model where I'm predicting the log of total transport sector CO2 emissions. That's specifically from non-short cycle organic fuels. So digging up old dinosaur bones and burning it in our cars. And then I had a bunch of controls here to try to control for the economic conditions in the city. So GDP per capita, nightlight emissions, whether it has an airport or a water port, but also stuff about land use efficiency. So the percent of open space, the built up area, how hilly the place is, which could change how engines function on the road network. And then looking at stuff like the infrastructure provision per capita, intersection density, straightness, and connectivity, proxied by the average node degree in the network. The key takeaways here are that a 1% increase in connectivity, so average node degree, we see about a 3% decrease in CO2 emissions. A 1% increase in straightness is associated with about a 5% decrease in CO2 emissions. 1% increase in intersection density, about a 0.15% decrease in CO2 emissions. And a 1% increase in per capita street length is associated with about a 0.45 increase in CO2 emissions. So places with more infrastructure per capita tend to have more CO2 emissions. But we can see here from these other elasticities places where policymakers might try to intervene. Now, I should mention, this isn't a causal model, this is just a correlational model, but it gives us some ammunition here to start thinking about this problem around the world and to develop new kinds of analyses to dig deeper into unpacking these relationships for that policy work around where we can target planning and policy interventions to try to cut global greenhouse gas emissions from cities. And then lastly, I am working on building a typology of street network form here by looking across a bunch of different urban areas in a lot of different dimensions where different places fall relative to each other. So this is just some preliminary work using a sample of 100 large cities across 8 dimensions, projected here with t-SNE. So because it's t-SNE, the units on the axes aren't meaningful. It's just kind of relative to one another. But we can see that there are clusters that start to emerge along the lines of what we might expect. So places like Chicago and Manhattan, dense, fine-grained grid-like places are similar to one another. Places like Phoenix and Las Vegas, sprawling late 20th century US Sunbelt cities are in the same cluster as one another. Shanghai and Beijing are pretty unique places that stand out in their own cluster. So I'm now expanding this analysis to those 9,000 urban areas that I've just modeled around the world. If you're interested in that piece of work, you can scan this QR code, or that you can use that URL to get to a working paper version of this work in progress to see more methodological details and findings from it. So to wrap things up, my goal for a lot of this work is to create better street network models and a richer set of indicators, more stuff across more places, so that other people don't necessarily have to. Too often, a lot of the street network science comes out of the world of statistical physics or computer science. It tends to be pretty alienating for a lot of urban planners or policymakers or qualitative researchers who may be interested in mixed method stuff around connectivity and access and how infrastructure segregates or connects different human populations. Hopefully, by making these things more readily available or easier to work with, that can help unlock new research pathways for other folks in the community. Second takeaway for me here is that we need better intersection counts and densities in transport research. From that preliminary analysis of how we measure count intersections, we can see there are important biases that shape our understanding of different places. That's a key step for future research. Next, I found that transport CO2 emissions decrease as connectivity, density, and strictness increase. The next step for that would be a causal model so that we can start trying to understand more about cause and effect to make a clear hook for policymakers to engage with that. But a lot of this speaks to existing theory about how we drive and what road networks are like. It's one more arrow in our quiver of ammunition, thinking about what we do as planners and what it means for the health of people living on this planet. And then lastly, the typology of street network form. Trying to think about what places are alike or dissimilar, why and how, helps us to think about alternative planning scenarios and think about the future of cities. It can help to destigmatize things like density when you show that we're not targeting some scary dystopia, but rather trying to make your city look a little bit more similar to Paris. It can ease the conversation sometimes about building housing or making places a little bit less car dependent if you can show them a positive alternative future. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you for your time.
Wonderful, thanks a lot. We all really appreciate it. So there have been a couple of questions posed in the chat. So I think it might just help to get on with a couple of them. We have one question here about the how OSMnx is adapted towards being able to analyze walking, biking, and transit networks.
So I mentioned earlier parameterizing a query so that you would choose a driving network. You can just change that parameterization to say walk or bike, and you'll get that infrastructure instead. Now it's not perfect, so your model will only be as good as the OSM data. OSM data is pretty complete for drivable infrastructure. And it's great for walking infrastructure in certain places, like if you're looking in San Francisco or something like that. It's not as good for small towns like in Iowa, let alone if you're trying to study walkability in Mozambique. So it'll take you only as far as the underlying data can take you. The good news is if you don't like the underlying data, anyone can go in and digitize it. So if you do want a nice walking model and you're studying walkability somewhere, please add in your local knowledge to the database.
Yeah, I guess that is one of the benefits of working with OSM like that. We have a question from Anna Basiri about the sort of topological consolidation algorithm that you mentioned in your talk. It's a rather complicated question, so I think I'll just read it directly. If the new relationship is defined based on an anon topological relationship, like the distance between the nodes, then the consolidated relationship may no longer be a topological relationship. Topological relationship, e.g. connectivity, should be a property of the topological space, which is invariant under homeomorphisms like rotation or scale. So I assume she's talking about the distance function. Mm-hmm. While consolidation methods are based on distance and a few others. Don't you think that causes a mathematical issue for future applications of this technique?
Now, is that specifically for the intersection consolidation?
I believe that's what she's referring to, yes.
Yeah, so typically, the way I've used that so far is for one-off. I don't save those networks as topologically consolidated because I don't have a great way of making it look perfect. I also don't currently count edge lengths in that topologically consolidated model because edge lengths are tough with complex intersections, period. You're either going to overcount or undercount a little bit. So what I do now is I use it mostly to get an accurate intersection count and then go back to modeling with more nodes in the graph because at least I'll get accurate distances. So yeah, your comment is totally right. I wouldn't want to use topologically intersection consolidated graphs as a final graph model for routing and stuff like that. But it's good for some things like counts and entities.
Cool. I hope that that's sufficient. I'm sure if it's not, Anna, go ahead and ask again and we'll get to your follow-up. I'd like to move to Sandeep's question here. He's curious about how intersection density decreases greenhouse gas emissions. He suggests that with higher intersection density, you'd expect more stops from vehicles. So he's not sure broadly if intersection density could be possibly correlated with lower traffic volumes.
Exactly. Yeah, so that would be the theoretical pathway that's taking. And you'll also notice that intersection density itself had a pretty small elasticity compared to some of the other elasticities, which is a finding that's been noticed before by folks like Robert Cervera, who did some similar research on this topic. Yeah, so typically in transportation theory, the way we would think about it would be that places with higher intersection density allow mode shifting away from driving trips. If you have very few intersections, it tends to be a very coarse-grained network. You need a car to get from point A to point B because it's awful to walk around. If there are lots of little intersections, it's very permeable and you can move easier on foot or by bike. So it's not about making your engine more efficient, it's about making your legs do the walking instead of your car do the driving.
I think related to that, there was a question about some of the changes in urban form and structure that you talked about at the beginning of the talk. So Bennett Norman's asking, what do those kinds of reversals or changes in morphology, what do they mean for equity and climate?
Yeah, I'm afraid they don't mean enough. In terms of both, you tend to see these places developed under the new urbanist paradigm, often on the periphery of cities. So it'll be like a little greenbelt suburb development that has a fairly dense grid-like street network plunked down 40 miles from the job center in the city. That means everybody walks around their little neighborhood when they get home from work and they hop into their car and commute 40 miles each way in the morning. That also means that these places are often pretty exclusionary. So it's not like we're just building more housing in lower income communities and making it attainable for those communities to move into. This is like like for choice buyers who are able to buy into wealthy suburbs and drive everywhere, but still get the cute neighborhood they want to live in. So I don't know. It's better than nothing, but it's not the answer to our problems in the US, that's for sure.
Yeah, sure. No, that does make sense. We have a couple of other questions that are sort of more technical about OSMnx, things like, how do you make a circular histogram, or some other things. I think, Rachel, did you have a question you'd like to ask? Yeah.
I had a naive question, which was that you sort of motivated the beginning of your talk, juxtaposing sort of global north cities with Port-au-Prince and Monrovia. And you said something about sort of street networks and settlement patterns, and you sort of made it like an implicit connection. It felt like to me between sort of, I think sort of mobility within cities and the street networks that you're able to extract from OpenStreetMap. And I sort of wondered about the places in the world where, of course, people are moving because people have to move. And what we're seeing is, I mean, as you said at the end, this sort of drivable infrastructure. So I think my question is about sort of settlement patterns and how people actually navigate the city and interact with each other and all those other interesting things about cities and the extent to which drivable infrastructure really matters in different kinds of places.
Yeah, sometimes it matters more, sometimes it matters less, but almost all drivable infrastructure is also walkable infrastructure. You walk along the sidewalk, along the street. Only when it's like an explicit motorway, like freeway or something, is it not walkable at all. And it tends to be, capturing the largest mode shares in most places around the world too. I mean, even places like in the Netherlands, there tends to be a very large driving mode share, despite it being like best in class at like biking trips, for example. So it captures some parts of it well, some parts of it not well. The bigger challenge would be trying to do comparability in different places by looking at other kinds of modes. And the data aren't there right now. So if we try to look at just say pedestrian paths or walkable paths or something like that, or bike infrastructure, we'll just get sampling biases where places like San Francisco look really good, but there might be some small town in Denmark that just doesn't have it digitized there, and we wouldn't know that it's a sampling bias.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about the sort of invisible network where I live, which was sort of the original, they're called wagonways here, but were sort of original railroads that are now used to move about without a car, but they're not really visible even on Google Maps. I mean, some of them will be, but then you'll be out walking and they're just there. So it's sort of this, it underlies much of the urban fabric and connects housing developments because they're often sort of in between housing developments. And so I was sort of curious about how we can't get at that. And it probably matters for some sorts of places. Anyway.
Well, I mean, it's probably a big part of the collective consciousness in places where that sort of thing exists.
Yeah.
I'm curious if that's on OpenStreetMap now. So Google does not.
Well, now I am too. I only know about Google Maps. So anyway, I don't want to hog the last couple of minutes because I know that people really had questions for you.
No, it's quite all right. I think that we have exhausted the audience provided questions. So
we have exhausted the audience.
That's good. That's a goal.
Indeed.
Well, it's happy hour time there, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Have a cocktail.
Yeah. Well, the sun's been down here for like an hour where I am. Thank you so much. I'll let Levi do the last closing.
Yeah.
Direct thank you for
yes.
part in SAD 2020/21. Hopefully not 2022.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Geoff, for giving such a wonderful presentation. And thanks as well to all of you who have stuck around still. I'd like to, can everybody see the plug for the next talk, which is by Rafael Pereira on transport inequalities and access to opportunities. That'll happen in 2 weeks' time at the same time, which is 4 p.m. UTC. And we'd love to see you all again. So thanks very much. The recording will be posted on YouTube within probably the next 24 hours. So we are really grateful to everybody to attend. And thanks again to Geoff for such a wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Bye-bye.